This is the Canyon Torque On, and all it takes is one look at its moto-inspired frame and 180mm travel fork to see that this bike was meant to be ridden hard. Canyon actually classifies it as a downhill e-MTB on their website, and after spending a couple months on the bike, I think that's a pretty good way to think about it. And while downhill bikes offer unprecedented performance in some terrain, they can be a bit of a hassle in others. So in this video, we'll take a look at where the Torque On shines and where its aggressive geometry and long travel leaves it a bit bogged down. But before we do that, take a quick second to like this video to help other people find it. Now though, let's get on to the bike. Canyon first introduced the alloy version of the Torque On back in 2021, but this all-new carbon fiber frame is pretty dang different. For starters, it's now built around a mullet or mixed wheel setup and is 3.3 pounds or 1.5 kilograms lighter, as well as 25% stiffer than its full 27.5-inch predecessor. That put the weight of my size medium CF8 at a respectable 53.1 pounds or 24.1 kilograms, set up tubeless and without pedals or the bike's proprietary water bottle. And yes, you did hear that right. This bike has its own proprietary water bottle that actually sits up here inside the top tube. Now, Canyon decided to do that so that they could have more freedom in how they set up the suspension. I actually got along just fine with the 650ml bottle, and one-handed removal and stowing was easy to do on the fly. But you can rest assured that the bottle, as well as the cage it sits in, can be fully removed if you would prefer to go without. What can't be removed, however, is the through headset cable routing, as there are no ports on the side of the frame. And as much as these are hated on right now, I do think they make a little bit more sense on an e-bike like the Torque On than a traditional analog bike. Like the alloy version of the bike, the carbon Torque On has 175mm of travel in the back and 180 in the front. And Canyon does say that you could run a 190mm fork if you wanted to, but sadly the bike is not dual crown compatible just because of how thick the down tube is. Lastly, the bike features mounting bolts for a tool or frame bag under the top tube, generous chainstay protection, and a skid plate / down tube protector built into the battery cover. The last of which I used a bit more of than I would have liked, and I'll talk more about that in a second. But right now, let's talk about geometry. And if you thought this bike was big before, just wait till you hear some of these numbers. I'm 6'1", and I usually ride a size large mountain bike with a reach of around 470 to 480 millimeters. But when I reached out to Canyon, they actually suggested that I should get on a size medium bike, which has a reach of 475 millimeters. That's 25 millimeters less than the 500mm reach on the size large. The bike also has a steep 77.5-degree seat tube angle and a very tall 648mm stack. This, combined with the 63.5-degree head tube angle, made the bike feel every bit as planted as you'd expect on the descents, while still inspiring me to find side hits to pull off of and play around on. Climbing was a bit of a different story though, and the high stack and steep seat tube made for a borderline cramped feel, which was fine on straight fire roads but allowed for less body English on techier climbs. Unlike the analog version of the Torque On does not have any geometry adjusting flip chip built into the frame. And to be honest, that's a feature I would have liked to see, given the bike's super long, low, and slack geometry. At the back of the bike, the Torque On has 445mm chainstays, putting the wheelbase on my size medium at a whopping 1276mm. Lastly, the bike has just 32mm of bottom bracket drop, and that puts the bottom of this skid plate at just 250mm above the ground. And that really is just about as low as you can go, and I'll talk about how that felt on the trail in just a little bit. But right now, let's talk about the e-drive system that comes on this bike. The Canyon Torque On is powered by a 250-watt Shimano EP8 motor with a peak torque of 85 Nm. As powerful as that EP8 motor is, it's not quite as nuanced as some other motors on the market. But I don't think that should be a huge issue for most people looking to get this bike, as I'm guessing it's going to spend most of its climbing time going up fire roads. The bike does have 3 different power settings: Eco, Trail, and Boost, and I spent most of my time in the Trail setting. The motor on my CF8 is paired to a 720 watt-hour down-tube integrated battery, but a 900 watt-hour battery is available as well. It's pretty cool that Canyon is offering that 900 watt-hour battery on this bike, as there's not a whole lot of other fully trail-worthy e-MTBs that have that option. Now, to see just how far I could take the 720 watt-hour battery that I got on this bike, I decided to take it on a range test. Leaving the bike in trail mode the entire time got me 26.4 miles or 42.5 kilometers of distance and 4,899 feet or 1,493 meters of climbing. For reference, my riding weight is just over 200 pounds. To me, this was right about on the border of what I would consider acceptable to make it through my average rides that I'd want to do on my E-MTB. But again, for those who are looking to get even more range, you can always get the 900 watt-hour battery instead. Now though, let's talk about part spec. And as a direct-to-consumer company, Canyon is known for packing tons of value into their bikes. And this Torque-On CF8, the most affordable build, is no exception. Suspension duties are taken care of by Fox, with a 38 performance fork and Flow X2 performance shock. Setup was relatively easy on both, and I ended up running 195 psi on the shock with 14 clicks of rebound and 9 clicks of compression. Up front, I had 110 psi with 12 clicks of rebound and about a quarter turn of the sweep compression dial. Shimano covers the group set, with an SLX drivetrain paired with a Dior cassette and 4-piston SLX brakes fitted to 203mm rotors. I found the brakes to be a bit underpowered on flat-out sections of trail, but not frighteningly so, just enough to make me reach for them a bit earlier than I might otherwise. The rest of the cockpit is plenty well sorted as well, with a 800mm wide, 30mm rise bar paired with a 45mm reach stem. At the back of the bike, I got a 170mm Canyon Iridium dropper seat post. Mounted to this was a Physique Gravita Alpaca X5 saddle. Sadly, as much as I tried, I could not get along with the saddle's narrow 130mm width, and I ended up swapping it out pretty early on. I'm sure the saddle's great for descending and moving the bike underneath you without getting caught up on it, but I'm gonna say that anyone except for those with the narrowest of sit bones will probably want to replace that relatively early on. Last up, the bike rolls on some DT Swift's HFR 1700 rims wrapped in Maxxis tires. More specifically, a 2.5-inch Assegai in the front and a 2.6-inch DHR2 in the rear. Both tires feature Maxxis' EXO Plus casing, which I could potentially see being a little undergun for a bike like the Torque-On, but I never had any punctures while testing. All in all, the bike's high-quality part spec and high-quality frame far exceed what you'd expect from a $5,500 e-bike. With the exception of the saddle, which really came down to personal preference, I had zero issues with the build and would happily ride the bike as is. Now that we have the tech details out of the way, let's go on and talk about how the Torque-On performs on the trail, starting with the climbs. The EP8 motor provided more than enough assistance to get me up even the steepest hills, and as long as the power was constant, traction was very good as well. Where the bike struggled was in areas that required a bit more finesse, as the motor felt a bit more like turning on and off a switch as opposed to easing in and out a throttle. And this was most obvious on techier sections of trail, where the low bottom bracket required ratcheting the pedals, resulting in a jolty feeling that almost always resulted in the front wheel lifting or a loss of traction in the back. Like many modern e-bikes, the Torque-On also has a walk mode, which was a feature I used more than I would have liked for those techie climbs, as well as hiking up to repeat some sections of trail. As I mentioned earlier, the compact seated position of this downsized frame made for a very comfortable, upright, almost moto-esque feeling when climbing fire roads and more flowy terrain. And this made for some super fun uphill flow trail experiences while climbing. But once again, these two characteristics proved to be detrimental on techier climbs, where the smaller front triangle provided less room to maneuver over the bike when navigating tight corners or rocky sections of trail, and the low bottom bracket made this bike more prone to pedal strikes than potentially any I've ever ridden, even with the short 165mm cranks that the Torque-On comes spec'd with. All in all, the Torque-On does what it was designed to do quite well, and that's get you up the hill as quickly as possible so you can spend as much time going down as you can. But where it struggles is when that trail turns more technical. And sadly, that is going to limit this bike for some people. If you don't have a fire road or easy climb trail to access your favorite downhill trails, then it's probably not going to be the bike for you. But thankfully, I don't think that's going to be an issue for too many people interested in this bike, because really it is meant to be ridden on the same trails and almost the same intensity as a downhill bike. But before I talk about how this thing performs on the descents, take a quick second to go ahead and subscribe to the 99 Spokes YouTube channel, where we upload new videos every Friday. The bike features Canyon's triple phase 4-bar suspension that provides a pretty progressive tune, making it nice and soft through smaller impacts like braking bumps and trail chatter, but still plenty supportive on big hits and flat landings. The slack 63.5-degree head tube angle favored flat out descents, and honestly, that's really where this bike shined the most. The high stack inspires confidence in the steeps and does a good job at keeping the front end of the bike feeling lighter and poppier than you'd expect for a 53-pound e-bike. I'm sure that the relatively short chainstays and 27.5-inch rear wheel helped with this playfulness as well. making the bike feel surprisingly lively on even smaller jump lines and flow trails. One area where I sadly did not get a chance to ride the Torque On while I had it in for test is on any big bike park style jump lines. And I really think that's where this bike would shine the most. Its low center of gravity, low bottom bracket, and low slung top tube is going to be perfect for railing berms and throwing whips. And if that's what you're into and you want an e-bike to shuttle yourself to the top of said runs, then I really think that this Torque On is going to be great for you. Now, I'm sure that in the right hands, this bike can feel plenty nimble and agile on techier, slower speed trails. But for me, even with that smaller 27.5-inch wheel, it really did feel a bit more cumbersome when things got more technical. My biggest and really only complaint while descending had to do, once again, with that low bottom bracket. I bottomed out the frame multiple times and even relatively tame rock gardens. And if you're not familiar with this experience, it's quite jarring. This sadly left me feeling a bit hesitant to charge into those types of trails with as much speed as I'm sure this bike can handle. And again, speaks to the fact that I think this bike will do better in more open terrain like big jump lines or desert freeride. So as with climbing, I would summarize the descending on this bike by saying that it does what it was built to do and it does it very well. So if your local riding spot has a lot of big jumps, steep lines, or even big fast bermed flow trails, then I think you'd be quite happy with the Torque On. But if you tend to ride a lot more technical terrain where there's rock gardens and tight hairpin corners, then I think this bike's aggressive geometry, particularly that really low bottom bracket, is going to cause a little more harm than good. Lastly, let's talk about who this bike is for as well as how it compares to other e-bikes on the market. First and foremost, I think you have to understand that this is a purpose-built freeride machine. But freeride can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And where I think this bike is going to excel the most is in those wide open, fast, big jump lines or kind of desert freeride, maybe mini Red Bull Rampage type settings. I don't think, however, that the Torque On would thrive in areas like the North Shore where technical rock rolls and tight loamers are par for the course. I also wouldn't recommend it for someone looking for a long travel e-trail bike. Of course, the motor on this bike makes it more capable than a traditional downhill bike would be otherwise, but I think that's a good way to think about this bike. It's gonna excel where a typical dual crown bike would, and not so much in other places. Moving on to the comparisons, and the first bike that comes to mind when I think of a contemporary to this bike is the Specialized Turbo Kenevo, which in its comp build lists for $6,000, $500 more than the Torque On. The Kenevo comes with 27.5-inch wheels front and back and also gets a slight bump in travel with 180 millimeters in the back. The bike also comes with Specialized praised 2.2 motor and 540 watt-hour battery, but with an alloy frame and some lower tier components. The smaller battery and heavier bike will almost certainly decrease the range as well. In terms of geometry, the Kenevo is a bit more conservative than the Torque On, with a 64.5-degree head tube angle, lower stack, and thankfully a much higher bottom bracket. So which is better? Well, at least on paper, the Torque On's direct-to-consumer model gives it a bit higher value. But I definitely think there's something to be said about having the support of a local bike shop when you have a long travel e-bike. And while I haven't personally ridden it, I would say that the Kenevo seems like it's gonna be a bit more well-rounded, especially when things get a little more technical. But again, if you're wanting a bike that feels more like that electronic-assisted downhill bike, then I think the Torque On is the better option. The next bike that I want to compare this to is the YT Decoy Core 2, which costs the exact same $5,499. Like the Torque On, the Decoy features a carbon frame, mullet wheel setup, and the same Shimano e-drive system, though with a smaller 540 watt-hour battery. In terms of part spec, these bikes are nearly identical as well, though if I had to, I'd probably give a slight edge to the Canyon Torque. Where the bikes really differ is in their geometry and suspension travel. The Decoy has 10 millimeters less travel in the front and back, as well as much more conservative geometry, with a steeper head tube angle, shorter reach, shorter stack, and higher bottom bracket. I've actually spent a decent bit of time on the Decoy, and I would say that it's by far the most playful and maneuverable full-size e-bike I've ridden. That said, if outright speed and composure on big features is your top priority, then this Torque On is probably going to be the better option. In total, the Torque On is a freeride machine, and its powerful motor, 175 millimeters of travel, and very aggressive geometry makes it an ideal bike for hitting big features and fast shoots and not really needing to think twice about it. On top of all that is an extremely dialed part spec that wouldn't be out of place on a comparably priced analog bike, let alone a full-powered e-bike like the Torque On. If you have any questions about this bike that I didn't get a chance to answer in this video, then please go ahead and leave those in the comments and I'll do my best to get you an answer. While you're down there, if you haven't done so already, please go ahead and like this video, as well as subscribe to the 99 Spokes YouTube channel. And lastly, remember that bikes are for everyone. Have fun out there.